So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this update on the King County Strategic Climate Action Plan. We have the whole team that worked on this today to talk about it. They're going to cover each section, and then hopefully we'll leave a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. But if you do have any questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat function, and I'll try and keep an eye on that throughout. And I can ask those at the end, and then we'll try and open it up and get some organized chaos for Q&A online style. So I'm going to give just a brief introduction to the 2030 district. I think most of the names on here are members, so you all know what we do, but just for a little reminder, I'm going to give one anyway. So the CL23 District is a nonprofit we launched in September of 2011, and the idea behind it was to really just show that there was a business model behind urban sustainability. And we exist to try and break down the market barriers to sustainability in buildings to make things easier to achieve the goals of the district, which is a 50% reduction in energy, water, and transportation emissions by the year 2030. A lot of those goals sync up pretty nicely with what's in the King County Climate Action Plan. So we're very happy about that. Like I said, we're in downtown Seattle, so this is a map of the district. We pretty much run from the Starbucks Center up to mid-Lake Union, and then from the waterfront up to Capitol Hill and First Hill. The two tails that you kind of see in Capitol Hill go up to the Bullitt Center. And then we have an agreement with Capitol Hill Eco District to work together where we kind of share our goals and some of our data with them, and they help us out with outreach up there as well. So we have 260 buildings currently committed to the district goal. That's almost 60 million square feet. So we're doing pretty well. We have a lot of the big building owners and managers as members of the district, but we do have a lot of work to do to try and bring in some of those smaller to mid-sized buildings. So the work that we do, a lot of this is based on convening people together. So when we were able to do in-person things, we would try and get building owners and managers together with city officials, county officials to try and get projects done and see if we can overcome some of those hurdles. We educate, so like this session today, we're still doing a lot of education, even though now it is online. A lot of the stuff that we have concentrated on this year has been on how you can reopen your building in a safe and sustainable way. So there's a lot of opportunity out there right now with buildings being low occupancy to do some of the upgrades that you haven't been able to do when you have high occupancy. So there are things that you can do around that will save you energy and water, but also make it safer for your tenants when they come back to work eventually. And then we do a lot of demonstrations. So any of our projects that are achieving the 2030 district goals or working towards them, then we will highlight those projects and showcase what exactly they've done. And then we're also trying to demonstrate new technologies. So some of those market barriers that I was talking about, new technology that usually is very efficient is usually a little bit more expensive. So we really try and demonstrate that that technology works in your building. So we're trying to kind of kickstart it into the industry. We do a lot of advocacy work. We realize that the 2030 district goals are a challenge to get to. That's why it's called the 2030 challenge. So we try and advocate for programs and incentives with the city and county to make it easier for everyone to achieve those goals. And then we facilitate a lot of discussions. I kind of mentioned this with convening. The city and building owners have never really conversed very well, I guess the best way to put it would be. So what we try and do is bring them together to have those conversations to make sure that policies that are being created work for all parties. And then lastly, we celebrate our members. So if we just had our Vision Awards online this year, if you're interested, you can still watch that online on YouTube. So we celebrate our members who are going above and beyond the 23 district goals. So we gave 4 awards out this year in energy, water, transportation, and leadership. The One Union Square won the award for energy for the work that they had done with the Pay for Performance pilot program. The Expedia campus won the award for water as a salmon safe certified campus and the work that they've done for potable water savings. The Columbia Center won the award for transportation, achieving an 18% drive alone rate. And then we gave the leadership award to Microsoft for all the work that they have done this year to kind of work towards being carbon negative by the year 2050. So kind of a huge goal to work towards. And then some of the news this week shows that they're really taking steps towards that with some of their flying miles that they're trying to reduce. Also, I mean, a lot of our sponsors were at the beginning. I would really like to thank those. It's kind of impossible to do our work without them. Particularly this year, we're really trying to kind of overcome some hurdles. So their sponsorship dollars really help us get some work done. And that also goes to our funders as well. So Boeing, Bullet, and King County, who are on the phone, are kind of big funders of ours and help us bring the programs that we work on to our members. So very thankful to them. So with that, I will try and hand this over to Rachel.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and many thanks to Matthew for inviting us to speak to the 2030, I guess, crowd, I'll say. We have a high-level presentation I'll go over with my colleagues Matt Kuharek, Jamie Strobel, and Laura Whiteley-Bender. And sorry to call you out, Matthew, but we are not the only 4 people that worked on the SCAP. This is a collaborative effort by over 50 employees at the county that contributed or led significant portions. Plus, we had input from over 270 employees at open houses and lunch and learns and things like that. We had lots of stakeholder involvement, both from internal and external. I'll speak to that a little bit more as we get started, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me one moment. As Matthew said, I think we'll try to monitor questions in the chat per section and be sure to make time for questions. So anyway, let's just go ahead and launch here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. So what is the Strategic Climate Action Plan, or SCAP, that we'll refer to it for the rest of this presentation? It is the county's guiding document for climate policy and investments in greenhouse gas emission reduction, climate equity, and preparedness. It builds on our 2015 SCAP, and builds on the progress we've made in the SCAP, brings forward a lot of the priority actions and goals. Our work, of course, is led by data with updated emissions inventories and lots of community input, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It was transmitted to the King County Council on August 27th. We had a very small and socially distanced outdoor press event with the executive announcing the delivery to the council. Also, Councilmember Out the Grove joined us. And there's videos of the press event if you'd like to see them on our website, which will be available at the end of we have a link at the end of the presentation. So council is going to hear the plan in early 2021. There is a slight lag between transmittal and hearings simply because the council is looking at the county's 21-22 budget right now, which needs to be done by the end of the year. So we are taking this time to reach out to partners to bring awareness about the SCAP, answer questions, let folks know how their feedback was incorporated, and also let you know that there's opportunities to support the council, to support the SCAP as it's being heard in council. And there's a variety of ways to do that, whether testimony in person or via writing a letter of support. So if that's something that you are so moved to do, please reach out to us and we can, would love that. I think we have a lot of environmental champions on the council at this point, but getting voices from the community is always very helpful. So how is the 2020 SCAP stronger? There's a couple things that are really important to us. It has new guiding principles that will help both the development and the implementation of our goals, and I'll speak to that a little bit more in a second. We had a very collaborative process for co-development of actions and targets, as I mentioned, both with our internal staff for our operations targets, but also with a broad range of stakeholders for our external targets. In particular, in the development of the new section, the Sustainable and Resilient Frontline Communities section, that was co-developed with the Climate Equity Community Task Force, which Jamie convened, and she will speak about a little bit more in that section. We had updated technical analysis and shared commitments with cities, particularly our K4C, King County Cities Climate Collaboration Partners, which is our voluntary but formal partnership with the Port of Seattle and 16 cities that work collaboratively on countywide emissions. And then we have a new strategic framework for climate preparedness that Laura will talk about a little bit. That really broadens and deepens the reach of how we can prepare for the impacts. So I want to talk about this slide. There's a lot of words in the slide and I'm not going to go all over them. But what I did want to talk about is the guiding principles. Those are dotted out on the left-hand side. And these principles, as I mentioned, are intended to guide implementation of our climate commitments and broader county climate work as it evolves and advances in coming years. So these were developed by staff and approved through our climate leadership team. We think that these foundational principles will help ensure progress on SCAP commitments during challenging times. Just in full transparency, the SCAP was developed primarily in 2019. In February of this year, it was pretty much ready and was going through final review and edits. And of course, we've had a lot of changes over 2020 with the pandemic and concomitant economic issues and challenges, which have impacted parts of the county more than others. The executive has not wavered in his commitment to climate and environment work. However, we acknowledge that it may be slower for us to take action on some of these actions than others just because of funding. So this on the left, our guiding principles will help us to determine what's our priorities and how can we move where we have the most impact and influence while staying true to those principles. On the right-hand side, we can talk about a little bit about our climate engagement. So including diverse voices was a focus for the 2020 SCAP update. So we pursued an equitable engagement process, as I mentioned, receiving input and direction from county partners, frontline communities, community leaders, county government staff, and the public. So we included residents from communities all across King County and included mainstream environmental organizations, Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations, youth serving organizations, businesses, labor representatives, state and local jurisdiction representatives and scientists and lots of others. So we had lots of different engagement strategies. You can see we had both large workshops and smaller topic-based workshops. I see some names on our list here, folks that attended some of those workshops held last year. We tabled at King County Comprehensive Plan meetings, which was a good way to get to a different audience. And we also had an online information survey that helped give us a lot of information for people who weren't able to attend something in person, which is how these were back in 2019. We paid attention to language access and going to the communities where they are and really trying to provide a collaborative space for solution development and feedback. I'm going to move on here, just a little overview of the core sections. So section 1, the green on the left, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That includes strategies, priority actions, and performance measures to reduce emissions countywide and from county government operations. This section is very similar in format to the existing 2015 SCAP format, with just the exception of calling out greenhouse gas targets and policy for more clarity. In the middle, we have sustainable and resilient frontline communities. That is the new section that was co-developed by the Climate Equity Community Task Force, which seeks to bring the voices of frontline communities to the table, the policy table and the action table, acknowledges the multiple intersections between climate and racial justice. So Jamie will speak a lot more on that. There's 8 focus areas in this section. And then section 3 on the right, preparing for climate change. This identifies climate preparedness actions that help King County government and our communities prepare for the impacts of climate change and increase climate resilience, something clearly on folks' minds these days. There's 5 focus areas in this section. So then speaking to the 3 icons on the far left, you know, as I've mentioned, the scope of the SCAP is really broad, including commitments and actions focused on county operations, but also on community scale solutions. So the 2020 SCAP clearly identifies the role of King County government in all of its recommended actions, whether the role is to implement on the top left, to convene partners on the top right, or to support and advocate for broader solutions on the bottom, even when we don't have direct control. So this helps identify what pathway and how much influence the county has over specific actions. You know, as we've said all along, you know, partnership is going to be really critically important to reaching these goals. We know we can't do it alone. So that's why we're really excited to get out and meet with folks and talk about how we can move from development to implementation on these. So next I want to introduce Matt Kuharek. I'll let him speak for himself also, but Matt was the project manager, the overall project manager for the SCAP, and also the greenhouse gas emissions lead. And he's going to walk through that section in more detail. So Matt.
Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Matt Kuharek. Really happy to be able to present the first section of the plan and then pass it off to the other 2 section leads for the other 2 sections. So the first section is focused on reducing emissions and opportunities for carbon sequestration. Many targets and commitments in this section were co-developed with partners of the K4C, as Rachel mentioned. These actions are also reflected in updated shared commitments with the cities in the port, which represent a shared vision for countywide progress to reduce emissions, and were updated in the lead up to the 2020 SCAP. Countywide targets also build on technical analysis completed to support the update, which I'll share more information about. Pictured here was our last in-person elected official work session last fall on Mercer Island. You can see some of the elected official members of the K4C, and we continue to work through that forum just in a virtual format now. We've had a couple of great work sessions this year. And our overarching goals are in the green circle in the top right here at both the countywide scale and the government operations scale. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in the next slide. So go ahead, please. So this slide introduces an example of the technical analysis supporting the SCAP update. We call it the Wedge Analysis. It's a technical and graphical depiction of countywide emissions trends and high-level pathways to achieve shared targets. This type of analysis was done for both countywide and government operations emissions. And at the countywide scale, the pathways build on recent legislative successes, trends in emissions, and staff and partner analysis of what is both ambitious and achievable for different sectors. Key parts of this graphic include trends in historical emissions over the last decade, showing that while we've seen an 11% reduction in per person emissions, we have a lot of work to do to achieve the deep reductions needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. The top line is a status quo population growth projection of emissions with no additional implementation of climate action strategies. The orange diamonds show our existing shared countywide greenhouse gas targets. And then each wedge is a specific pathway towards emission reduction that includes a corresponding pathway or target in the 2020 SCAP. And then the area below the bottom green wedge are just remaining emissions over time. And a few of the key findings from this analysis, most importantly, I think, is that we've done the math and co-developed pathways to reach our overarching targets, pathways that are both ambitious and achievable. Secondly, we have a lot more confidence in the path ahead as a result of recently passed state legislation, such as the Clean Energy Transformation Act. That's the bottom green wedge. As a note, all the solid wedges in here are adopted state or federal regulatory pathways that still need to be implemented, but are now on the books that will help us get about halfway towards our 2030 goal. And then finally, the flip side of that is that analysis shows there's still major solutions that need implemented at the local level, such as building efficiency, low carbon fuels, and actions that reduce car trips. So yeah, I think next slide, please. So I'm going to walk through in the next slide the 6 GHG focus areas and highlight key strategies and targets included in each. And examples that I highlight will include a mix of both operational and countywide strategies, targets, and priority actions. In introducing each focus area, I'll also share an example of how we're leading with integrating equity and social justice across the whole SCAP. So this first section, targets and policy, is the only new GHG focus area. It's the place where all the county's policies and GHG policies and targets are pulled together with a strategic look at what's next. Examples of new 2020 SCAP commitments include partnering with cities and other partners, including the county's Climate Equity Community Task Force, towards development of even stronger long-term 2040 and 2050 targets. We have an existing 80% target, but there's a lot of good reasons to go even deeper. And we want to work with our cities and other partners to set new shared long-term targets. A second highlight is to develop new pathways to reduce consumption-based emissions. That first slide was a look at or the previous wedge analysis slide was a look at geographic-based emissions, which are, very important and what we often have the most direct control over, but they're not the complete picture of our community's impact on emissions and climate. And so there are new commitments to develop similar analysis and update all of our data around consumption-based emissions. And a third highlight in this section is that where we have direct control, we have updated our operational target, which was an 80% by 2050 goal, to be an 80% by 2030 goal, and to develop actions to achieve that reduction in the next 10 years. The second focus area, transportation and land use, is I'm sorry, my wife is yelling in the background. Jeez. So Metro's mobility framework was co-created with Metro's equity cabinet, and it served as the foundation for countywide commitments in this focus area. Metro also led foundational technical analysis in support of the SCAP update that demonstrated that to achieve the overarching goals we have to reduce car trips and vehicle miles traveled, a really comprehensive 3-part strategy is needed. And this means to both sustain and significantly increase transit, focus even more development in urban areas and centers, and a new set of interests and commitments for the county around implementing vehicle usage pricing equitably, things like congestion pricing. And only through a combined package of deep commitments in these different sectors are we going to get to the type of car trip reductions we need to achieve our overall goals. On the county operations side, the SCAP includes strong commitments to reduce fleet vehicle emissions in support of the strengthened 80% by 2030 county operation targets, with a major focus on vehicle efficiency and electrification, like electrification of the county's metro buses. The next slide. Focus area 3 is buildings and facilities energy. I know a topic near and dear to many of you. The overarching goal in this focus area is to reduce energy and fossil fuel use in the built environment and increase the use of clean energy supplies and technology. At the countywide scale, it updates targets for reducing energy use from the built environment by 25% and sets a new set of targets to reduce fossil fuel use by 20% by 2030, including to partner to develop energy efficiency programs, work to make programming an action to convert oil and propane heated homes to clean energy sources, propose a new county-led commercial property assessed clean energy program, obviously support equitable implementation of the state's Clean Energy Transformation Act. And this section also includes a focus on efficiency and renewable energy access and opportunities for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and people living with low incomes, such as through community solar and in the transition from fossil fuel use in buildings. And at the operational scale, this is an area where we've made tons of progress over recent years. And the SCAP extends strong energy efficiency for government operations, commits to reduce fossil fuel use in existing buildings and eliminate it in all new facilities and infrastructure, and recommits the county to use 100% carbon-free electricity and advances new solar and biogas projects. The fourth of the 6 GHG focus areas, green building. At the countywide scale, highlights include to work with partners to advance strong state green building codes, updating building codes in unincorporated King County, where the county is the lead agency and responsible government to contribute to countywide energy and GHG targets, commits to improving commercial energy code to reach net zero goals by 2031, and supports the development of and equitable access to green affordable housing. And for county operations, the county has been a leader on green building and sustainable development, and it continues that, including building on recent progress to develop more than 10 net zero in living building challenge projects to set a new goal of 20 projects by 2025, and updates and strengthens our commitment to integrate equity and social justice into all of our capital projects. So I have one more slide, please. So the final 2 GHG focus areas, first, consumption and materials management. The overarching countywide goal for this focus area is to achieve a circular economy whereby waste is minimized through prevention, reuse and recycling, and materials stay in use longer. Highlights at the countywide scale include to spur and support new recycling markets, implement a regional organics plan, prioritize food waste strategies such as increasing food donation, and continuing major infrastructure improvements at county-owned transfer stations to support recycling. At the county operations scale, highlights include increasing the use and purchase of sustainable and recycled content products, and a major commitment to ramp up the use of low embodied carbon materials in constructions with a focus on concrete. And then the final GHG focus area is forest and agriculture. Key goals include increasing land protection, forest restoration, expanding local farming, and increasing carbon sequestration associated with both forest and farming. Highlights include advancing recommendations of the Open Space Equity Cabinet, including committing to invest at least $25 million and acquire at least 25 equity open space opportunity sites in the next 5 years as part of work to improve access to urban green space. Finalizing and implementing a new shared countywide 30-year forest plan, and for the county to plant, protect, and prepare 3 million more trees in the next 5 years. So that concludes a quick overview to this section. As I pass it off to our next speaker, I want to again thank the so many partners who helped develop the recommendations in this section. I know many of the folks on the phone participated in workshops and sessions supporting development or provided comments that supported development of it. And the next section will be an introduction to the Sustainable and Resilient Frontline Community section. And I'm happy and excited to introduce Jamie Strobel. She's the county's Climate Engagement and Community Partnerships lead. She's the lead for this section and also was the lead facilitator for the Climate Equity Community Task Force, which you'll soon learn more about. So thanks, and I'll check the chat and see if there are any questions.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to share a kind of a high-level overview of the work that we completed for this new section of the plan. This section was co-led with some members of the community. There were 22 members in the Climate Equity Community Task Force, and then we also had an internal team of county staff that worked in all of the kind of issue areas that the task force identified. And together we co-developed a lot of the issue areas in here. So you'll see that the way that we defined Frontline for this purpose was communities that are going to disproportionately bear the impacts of climate change, as well as face current and historic inequities. And then also have kind of more limited capacity and resources to adapt. And so it's not enough to just live in an area that is disproportionately impacted by a climate impact, but it's also kind of the confluence of factors of, for example, if you lived in a floodplain, it's not just enough to do that if you have a multi-million-dollar home, but if you are low income living there, also have current health conditions, or are facing the lasting impacts of systemic racism, then all of those kind of factors combining to increase your sensitivity to climate change. And so this is really meant to create an intentional space to be able to have those folks be a part of guiding what our goals and strategies should be. This also, so you'll see to the left, that's the vision for the section as a whole. And as I go through these slides, I'm just going to share a bit about what each focus area they developed out. So next slide, please. So there were 8 different focus areas that came out of this process. And each of these are kind of establishing a vision for what the future they want to look like, and then we worked with county staff to come out with what are some actions that we want to move forward. I want to highlight quickly around there that some of this was looking at how do we kind of change the way that we bring communities to the table. So not just the 3 public meeting standard of the past several decades ago, but how do we kind of get towards really changing the dynamics so that there is a community-driven leadership model, that we're kind of bringing those to the table to inform decisions that directly impact them. And then how do we set up our internal structures to really lead with equity in our work? Community capacity development was one that came out because some of our community members said, it's great that we're at this table, it's great that we're able to do this, but how do we bring more of our people to the point where they can sit at a table like this, so that we can have build up the capacity within our own communities. And so a big piece out of this was language access, and making sure that we have materials in multiple languages, that we're kind of building a shared climate literacy on both sides, on the community side as well as on government. Equitable green jobs and pathways is a new section as well. This is looking at how do we create, as we transition from a clean and greener economy, how do we kind of move skill sets, how do we train for that, how do we create pathways for young people, and then also how do we diversify the environmental movement, and which has not the greatest numbers in terms of diversity, and not just kind of at the like buildings and trades level, but also looking at our science positions, our policy positions, our leadership work. And there are goals here, not just internally to the county, but as a workforce as a whole for the region. So we actually have a budget proposal in right now to support a position that would kind of develop out what that strategy might look like in the future, working with all our different partners and stakeholders. So this doesn't actually have that full strategy in there. It's more about, this is how we want to make sure we go about developing that strategy. Public health and emergency preparedness. I think what's important to note here is that we decided, instead of we had 2 options. Do we infuse equity throughout our entire plan, or do we create a separate section that's a focus on climate change and equity? And we decided that really we needed both. While we have this separate section, what's great is that we actually have pieces of this in both the GHG reduction and preparedness sections. And there are pieces that are actually cross-listed in both, and you'll actually see a little icon, that little climate justice icon in the middle. You'll see something similar to that is highlighting the things that are kind of cross-listed. And so some of those things include the affordable green housing work, the public health thing. We have a urban heat island strategy that Laura is going to talk a little bit about, that is also kind of a priority for the community. And then 2 new sections, housing security, anti-displacement, food systems, and food security. We're kind of working to bring in different county programs that are newer to kind of being a part of the climate plan. We brought in DCHS, the Department of Community and Human Services, and their Affordable Housing Task Force staffers to really align us with how could we find kind of co-benefits in both of that work. We also worked with the local food initiative and public health around food, and then energy, justice, and utilities. This one is, as we transition, how do we make sure that we're not creating a kind of an energy security gap, that people aren't kind of falling in between where they don't quite qualify for any sort of subsidies, but then they are not being able to afford their utilities and are making some really difficult decisions. So we've been partnering with Puget Sound Sage, a local environmental justice organization, and they're working on a grant to do 100% renewable cities, and especially partnering with communities of color and what those strategies might be. And so for this one, we're working with them to kind of identify what are the right places that we can help influence, that we can kind of close those gaps. I think something that's really telling is that some of the research they did, they just produced a report called Powering the Transition that's available online if you're interested. And they found that there were some families who are having to make hard decisions around basic needs, where they were actually unplugging fridges over the weekend and putting their food all in a cooler just to save on their electricity bills. And so I think that's the kind of thing we don't want to see. And how do we protect and support those that are the most vulnerable to changing energy prices, changing food prices, and climate impacts. So, and then lastly, the transportation access and equity. Metro ran this amazing Metro Mobility Equity Cabinet. We actually have 2 members of the task force who also participated in that process. And we wanted to make sure that the task force wanted to make sure that they were uplifting pieces of that mobility framework that they found alignment with. And so you'll actually see in this section that they're directly pulled bits and pieces from the Metro Mobility Framework to really say that we agree with this, this is great, and we want that to move forward. Next slide, please. Lastly, throughout all of these focus areas, there's 6 strategies that kind of came out as highlighted themes. I already kind of talked about some of these, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but building up our capacity internally to run equitable engagement, community engagement processes, making sure language access is a priority, making sure community leadership is a priority. Addressing root causes, not just trying to put a band-aid on something, but how do we actually get towards like what is actually causing some of the systemic inequities, and how do we create solutions about that? And then 5 is it's not just about who's being disproportionately impacted, but how are we creating future solutions where all folks get to benefit. So it's not just, for example, in the case of solar energy, that it's not just homeowners who have the capital to be able to benefit from renewable energy technology. So really creating intentional opportunities for low-income people, for renters, for communities of color. And so that's kind of what that one is. And lastly is aligning initiatives. So really we have so many programs across the county that are serving a lot of the same communities that also have a focus on equity. They might be looking at health equity or economic development or housing. And so really part of this section was really trying to intentionally pull those people from across the county to think about how can we work smarter, not harder on this, and align our goals and maybe get some co-benefits from this work, especially given that we are going to be facing some tougher budgetary times in the wake of COVID-19. So And with that, I'm going to pass it to Laura to talk about the preparedness section.
Thanks, Jamie. Good morning, everybody. My name is Laura Whiteley-Bender, and I'm the Climate Preparedness Specialist for King County. And my job is to help lead and coordinate our efforts to prepare for the impacts of climate change, not only within King County programs and divisions, but also strengthening regional partnerships to help increase resilience across King County. So the Preparing for Climate Change section is in the 2020 SCAP is building on a strong foundation of work from the 2015 SCAP, but includes several new elements worth noting. First, we have a new and first time overarching vision of success, which you can see there on the right in the blue circle. That vision of success is framed around reducing vulnerability and increasing the resilience of communities, natural systems, and the built environment to the impacts of climate change. So we want to reduce the harms while boosting those aspects of our communities and our systems that provide inherent resilience to climate change and seek to strengthen those natural assets. Second, the new Preparing for Climate Change section includes 5 strategies for focusing and organizing our preparedness work. And it includes a first-time performance measurement system to help ensure that we are actually making progress towards that vision of success. And then finally, it includes a much broader set of preparedness activities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things that I like to emphasize when speaking to folks who may be less familiar with preparing for climate change as an area of work, or even when meeting with elected officials, I like to talk to them about why do we want to plan for climate change now, particularly as we get into some tighter budget situations. There could be this tendency or this interest in just deferring, right? Why don't we just kind of wait to tackle this later? And in a constrained budget environment, I would argue that we still need to be investing in our climate preparedness efforts because we simply can't afford to wait. For reasons that are not going to be surprising for you all, we know that climate change is occurring. We know that the pace of change is accelerating, and we know that the impacts in the next few decades are largely unavoidable because of past and current greenhouse gas emissions and the accumulation of those emissions in the atmosphere. Second, and I think this is really important when you think about the role of local governments in shaping our communities, we are making decisions on a daily basis that has long-term impacts within our communities. And the choices that we make today and the degree to which we are able to build climate considerations into those choices will ultimately shape how climate change affects our communities going forward. Third, we know that significant time is required to actually identify and implement adaptive measures, sometimes years, sometimes decades, to really see the benefits, or sorry, not to see the benefits, but to see that those changes really get baked into the system, not unlike new energy technologies and emerging energy technologies, and how it takes time for those to really fully integrate into our energy systems. And then lastly, we know that proactive planning is generally more effective and can be less costly, and more importantly, it can provide benefits today. So climate change exacerbates many of the natural hazards that we already face by changing the frequency, intensity, and duration of those events, which means that when we get the 500-year flood, which could happen tomorrow, or we get that next heat wave or that next drought, which again could happen tomorrow, we will see the benefits of those investments that we're making in preparedness and be able to continue to improve conditions for our communities and our natural systems. Next. So as noted earlier, there's a new strategic framework for the Preparing for Climate Change section, and this new strategic framework is really more focused on how we do our work rather than organizing the actions by specific climate impacts. The strategies are organized into 5 focus areas, which are listed on the left. That focus area framework builds consistency with other parts of the SCAP. And then there on the right, you'll see the specific strategies that are associated with each focus area. So we are looking through this 2020 SCAP to make sure that we are accounting for climate change and policies, plans, practices, and procedures and implementing those decisions. So this was really focused on looking at how we do our work and how we can make sure we are asking the climate question as we are updating our comp plan, for example, or building new infrastructure. The second strategy is around investing in and using best available science and other technical information. So we want to make sure that we're continuing to make those investments and use the best available information to inform our decisions. The third strategy is around prioritizing health and equity and climate preparedness actions. So we want to make sure that we are intentionally thinking about and putting forward actions that center around improving health and equity outcomes. But we also, I'll note, want to make sure that as we're implementing all of the actions across the 5 strategies, that we are also accounting for and prioritizing health and equity. So there's multiple layers to that strategy. The fourth strategy is around strengthening collaborations and partnerships. So this is recognizing that climate change impacts cross-jurisdictional boundaries, and we will be able to, and in many with climate change, and in many cases, there may be different solution sets that become available to us when we look at that larger scale. And then lastly, we want to invest in public outreach, engagement, technical assistance, so that we can work together with King County communities and residents to build a shared understanding of how climate change affects our community, adapting to those changes, and then things that individual communities and residents can be doing to boost their own resilience to climate change. Next. Thank you. For my closing slide, I just want to take a step back from some of the overarching framework and really talk about some of the key priorities within this SCAP specifically. There are 61 actions, preparedness actions in the preparing for climate change section. And those actions are focused on several key priorities. First, we want to make sure we are reducing climate risk. So I mentioned earlier that our strategic framework is focused on how we do our work, but I want to just make sure that it's clear that we do have actions that are really specifically targeting many of the climate impacts and hazards that we're concerned about. So these are actions specifically related to stormwater management, forest health and wildfires, sea level rise, flooding, lower summer stream temperature, and hotter summer temperatures. As Jamie mentioned earlier, we have an action, for example, to develop an urban heat island strategy that's going to incorporate information from a heat mapping project that we did this summer and really look to see how we can bring different initiatives together to really help address those elevated temperatures in those urban heat islands. Second, we really want to make sure we're operationalizing climate preparedness into our capital planning processes and other processes. So this is really where we want to make sure that we are becoming an adaptive organization. So do we have the capacity to bring in new information about climate impacts? Do we have the capacity to ask the right questions about how that new information affects our decisions? And just as importantly, do we have the capacity and authority to make different decisions based on that information? And then third, we want to make sure that we are accelerating regional preparedness. So for the reasons I noted earlier, working across jurisdictional boundaries and working with our partners is going to be so critical to ensuring that we are boosting the resilience, not only of King County as a government and the things that we're directly responsible for, but really as a community of communities within the King County region. Final slide. So this concludes the formal presentation, and I want to thank you all for your interest and turn it back over to Matt and Rachel for any questions.
Thanks, Laura. I don't know, Matthew Combe, we got too many Matts on the phone. I don't know how you wanted to handle the question and answer. I see there's one from Juliana that Matt Kuharek answered on the chat. I want to make sure that we've responded. If we make sure we answered her question. So I don't know, Juliana, if you had a follow up, maybe come off mute and ask.
No, that did answer my question. I think a lot of, especially you guys were just talking about making informed decisions, just having that transparency and really focusing on that helps people make choices a little bit better.
Great. I'm just going to stop sharing so we can all see each other.
So I didn't have a huge plan for a Q&A. Like you said, it was only Juliana that really asked a question in the chat. I did have one that's kind of related around the 80% reduction in emissions. So a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about as a district is related to the IPCC report, where that shows that we need to be kind of net zero by 2050. So is there a reason why 80% was chosen as the goal, and then is there kind of a plan for that last 20%?
Yeah, I could start with this, and then Rachel can jump in. So that 80% is a shared target that was adopted back in 2014 between the county and all 39 cities in the county. And there's, the county conceivably could have set a new target in the 2020 SCAP, but it would have been just our target and not a shared target. And we really think it's more meaningful to have that kind of a shared target that we have. And so there's a commitment in the SCAP to work in 2021 to to strengthen our shared target. And so we started that work, and there's kind of three main reasons we want to reach towards net carbon neutral by 2050 at the countywide community scale. One is we got a lot of public input and partner input that the county should go stronger and deeper. Also, that's what the science is telling us to do, as you just said. And then thirdly, the state legislature passed stronger statewide targets that, the state's targets were weaker than the county's targets, and now the 2050 target is stronger than the county. So we want to continue to lead at the local level. And so that's another rationale. So that'll be a political process that will be, those targets would be formally adopted by the Growth Management Planning Council, and then the King County Council in 2021. But yeah.
And I'll just add that we earlier this month, we held a K4C elected official work session where Matt and the K4C staff co-chair presented this opportunity to work towards strengthening and understanding what it would take to reach a net zero by 2050 target. We had almost 40 elected officials on the line, and overwhelmingly supportive of moving towards those goals. Some wanted to learn a little bit more, which is understandable, but definitely I feel like we've got the political will behind it. We just need to figure out the math and understand what it would take to get there. There's clear support on the part of staff also to move towards stronger targets.
Great, thanks. So we have another question in the chat from Robin Briggs, which is, the budget is being finalized before the SCAP comes before the council. Has this made a difference in what is being budgeted for? And is there a list of which SCAP items are accounted for in the new budget? How is this approached when designing the budget?
You want to go, Rachel? You want me to?
You can start. Go first. Unless you want me to.
Yeah, no, I'll answer part of it. So, the 2021-2022 budget, which the council is hearing now, does advance the SCAP priorities, even though the SCAP has not yet been adopted by the council. And that has created some questions, like, for example, the 2020 SCAP recommends work on a new green job strategy and program, and the budget proposed a new funding to support that work. That's a priority identified by the Climate Equity Community Task Force and by the County Council and others beforehand. So the council's wants to know more about that proposal and how it lines up with the SCAP. So I think we did still advance the 2020 SCAP through the current budget proposals, even though the timing isn't perfect. And then I guess is there a list of which SCAP items are accounted for in the new budget? There is a climate budget policy paper that provides highlights of how the executive proposed budget advances the SCAP. And that's posted and we can share it. It's not a comprehensive list, but it has some good highlights.
Just to add on that, a lot of the work that is done on the SCAP is not done by this team of 4 people. A lot of it's done in the agencies. And so when they put forward their agency budget, it includes work to do, it includes funding to work on SCAP items, whether they're a complete standalone or part of their existing ongoing work. So we have a decentralized model. It's a little different than, say, the city of Seattle that has a very centralized model. So there is some funding being requested for the 4 of us, those that work across the county to work on projects also. So that's in the budget. Just real quick, also, we have one more minute. I want to answer Kirsten's responding. Oh, and Robin, also, I know we still owe you some questions and I have not forgotten that. Kirsten, the decision before council on SCAP to approve or is really, the council always has the prerogative to edit and review the SCAP. And in the 2015 SCAP, they did make some revisions to the structure. I actually wasn't at the county, so Matt could probably speak more to that. We are clearly hoping that it will be an approval in bulk. They may want to make some changes to things. And again, that is something that council obviously has the authority to do.
Yeah, that's a good description. They like to add things.
So Rachel, you mentioned that we're pretty much out of time. The last thing, I guess I'd like you to remind people how they could get involved to support this going through council going forward. And just as an FYI, we can put some of that in the email follow-up as well to folks.
Yeah, great. So just to recap, so, there's a couple ways that you could support. One is to write a letter from you individually or your organization supporting the SCAP. If it aligns strongly with your organization's goals and targets. Another way would be to provide testimony at council hearings. I have to admit, I'm not sure what council hearings are going to look like in January and February. They're all virtual now and testimony is somewhat limited. What I can say is that I will promise to keep in touch with Matthew Combe and other organizations that we are working with to let you know what timing and schedule and opportunities are.
Perfect.
You can also sign up for our newsletter if you want on our website, just kingcounty.gov/climate. And at the bottom of the page, there's a place to sign up for our newsletter. We'll often kind of post updates on where we are in the process there.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for speaking today and giving us the update. Thanks to everyone still on the line. Our next session is November 19th on stormwater. If Ellen is still on, there you go. She's just plugged all the information in the chat for what we're going to be talking about, and we'll send the invite for that out soon, along with the follow-up on this session. So have a great day, everyone, and enjoy the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.